It's my privilege to greet you once again with a word from the Old Testament, from Psalms. This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. You may wonder, what does this word has to do with science and faith? See, it tells, this is the day. I was just going through that part. Day, period of time, a long time. It can mean several things. This is the day. The Lord has made. God has made. The word made in Hebrew is very interesting. It's somehow fashioning it, making it, not letting it just evolve, but purposefully making it. And the end result is, we should be happy. That's why we are here. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I was wondering about the word rejoice. You know, most of the time people think the Hebrew language is the mother of all languages and all the languages evolved from it. See, I am a Tamil person, I think differently. Because earlier it was Tamil who influenced many other languages. That's how a lot of people think. The mother tongue is very important. So why do I say that? The word for rejoice is keel. It's very closely related to the word kali hurudal, kali, real joy that springs deep from within. You cannot even control it. That is the happiness, rejoice. And then it comes, be glad. In English or in Hebrew it is a synonym. But if you apply the Tamil sound, the phonetics to that, it means again, santosh. No, sama is the word that is used there. Be glad, sama, santosham. Perhaps it may be Sanskrit word, we do not know. But it sounds really, be happy because God has made this day, where science and faith declaration can come together. So the Andrew Wall Center that has the privilege of inviting Professor McGrath, it dedicates its energy to the study of Christians and their interactions in Africa and Asia, not only over there, but also here in our own country, here United Kingdom, how people from various countries have enriched the local Christianity. And we have a center, a large collection, and it is one of the many treasures that are in this university. So we are happy, and it's my joy to greet you. Now I request Professor Nicholas Rees, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, to come and welcome you
all. Thank you very much, Professor Jairaj, and you're all very welcome here to Liverpool Hope tonight on what is a little bit rainy, a little bit dark out there. So thank you very much for joining us for this very special event, and particularly a warm welcome to Professor Alister McGrath, who's come here to join us on this occasion to talk about God, science and faith. I'm going to pass over shortly to Professor Peter McGrath to introduce our speaker. But I'd like to say thank you for coming to this university. And I think Liverpool Hope is quite a special university in that we are, I think it's fair to say, probably unique in the European context and maybe more so in other parts of the world, in that we are an ecumenical foundation where we do bring people of both faith and no faith together. And we're very committed to a program of study in which we hope to enrich the lives of our students and in which we believe in educating the whole person. And that very much plays into the theme of the type of work we do here at the university. We're very proud of our Department of Theology, Philosophy and Religious Studies. It's one of our original founding deanery, in fact, here at the university. It has a long distinguished history that predates the creation of Liverpool Hope and goes back to its founding colleges. And we're also very proud of the research traditions we have in this department. And I think we've just heard from Professor Jairaj talking about how we have a centre around the study of African and Asian Christianity. But we also have an institute around the study of pastoral theology and Christian education. So in lots of ways we are fully committed as a university to this area. And I do hope you will join us and come and use some of our facilities. Professor Jairaj has mentioned the library and the Andrew Walls collection, which is superb and is always being added to. And we do think this is a rather unique collection in its own way again. And we've benefited very greatly from contributions from outside bodies here. I'm not going to say a lot more at this stage, just to thank you very much for coming, both to my colleagues who are in the audience, but also to those who have come from outside organisations to be with us tonight. My thanks to Professor Jairaj for organising the event, and obviously to our Professor Gerald Pillay, our Vice-Chancellor and Rector, who has sponsored it. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn over, if I may, to the Reverend Professor Peter McGrath.
Our speaker this evening has been since 2014 the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, where he is Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion at Harris Manchester College. Professor McGrath was previously Professor of Theology, Ministry and Education at King's College London, where he also headed up the King's Centre for Theology, Religion and Culture. And earlier still, between 1995 and 2004, he was Principal of Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. In the name of the Department of Theology, Philosophy and Religious Studies, and indeed of the whole Liverpool Hope University family, I am delighted to welcome a scholar of such stature and renown to our university this evening. Professor McGrath is eminently suited to bring the fields of science and religion into dialogue. He began his academic career as a scientist, gaining first-class honours in chemistry and a doctorate in molecular biophysics at the University of Oxford. He subsequently went on to obtain a first-class honours degree in Christian theology, again at Oxford, and eventually received 2 higher doctorates from the same universities, Doctor of Divinity in 2001 and Doctor of Letters in 2013. The second of these was specifically for his research into science and religion, a research interest that has borne fruit most notably in his 3-volume work, A Scientific Theology, 2001 to 2003. To a general readership, however, Professor McGrath's engagement on the interface between science and faith is most readily associated with his work engaging with the new atheism, and in particular with the thought of Richard Dawkins. In this regard, his publications bear witness to his capacity to communicate complex ideas to a number of different audiences. That is, from the 2004 largely academic text, Dawkins' God, Genes, Memes and the Meaning of Life, to the now very well-known The Dawkins Delusion, Atheist Fundamentalism and the Denial of the Divine, co-authored with Joanna Collicutt McGrath for a general readership and published in 2007. More recently still, Professor McGrath has turned his academic attention on the life and work of the great Christian academic C.S. Lewis. In 2013, he published the highly acclaimed biography, C.S. Lewis, A Life, Reluctant Prophet, Eccentric Genius, to mark the 50th anniversary of the death of Lewis. Professor McGrath's extensive research raised what is probably the most radical and eyebrow-raising suggestion of the book, namely that Lewis had misremembered the date of his own conversion. This evening, Professor McGrath brings together these different strands of his research to speak on research and faith, Richard Dawkins versus C.S. Lewis on the meaning of life. Those of you who are familiar with his work in these fields will know that what we are about to hear is going to be scholarly, erudite, and deeply, deeply humane. Professor McGrath, welcome.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a great joy it is to be here in Liverpool this evening. And as you'll see, the topic of our lecture tonight really brings together 2 very interesting figures, Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis. And what I want to do is just use each of these to open up questions and begin to engage with them. I think you'll find these very interesting. And basically, we're going to look at a number of things tonight. I'll talk a bit about who Dawkins and Lewis are, although I suspect many of you will know that already. Then we'll look at three big questions, and we'll try and open these up using Lewis and Dawkins as dialogue partners. Is faith reasonable? In other words, do you have to leave your brains behind if you become a person of faith? Secondly, I think a very live question for many of you, does science disprove God? And then thirdly, a question that Dawkins and Lewis both write about, which is, what's the point of life? And I want to try and just look at how they focus on this. And in many ways, what I'm simply saying is, look, these are big, interesting questions. They arise naturally in thinking about the relationship between Christianity and science, and Dawkins and Lewis really help us to do this. As I think many of you will know, I'm much more sympathetic to Lewis than I am to Dawkins. But I am going to say that Dawkins raises some very good questions, even though I don't think the answers he gives are really all that persuasive. So why am I talking about this? Well, I suppose I thought partly it's interesting, but also it just fits in so nicely with my own life story. Because when I was growing up in Northern Ireland back in the 1960s and studying science and knowing that I wanted to go into science in quite a big way, it just seemed to me to be so obvious that if you were going to be a scientist, you had to be an atheist. If I can put it like this, that science gobbled up the space once occupied by God. I just took the view that, if you're a religious person, then you were mad or bad or sad and possibly all three. And it just seemed to me that there was no way you could be a person of faith and at the same time a scientist. I no longer think that. Although very often when I remember what I thought in those days, it makes me all nostalgic because, sort of views that Richard Dawkins holds today, I held back then in the 1960s. But when I came to Oxford, I encountered challenges to this very naive understanding of the relationship of science and faith. And I began to realize that I had a lot of rethinking to do. And so in effect, having discovered that atheism wasn't quite as exciting and reliable as I thought it was, and Christianity was much more interesting and exciting than I had realized, I began to see things in a very new way. And these three questions, were all ones I wrestled with when I converted from atheism to Christianity. And so, in many ways, what I'm going to do is open up these questions using Dawkins and Lewis to kind of help us on our way. But let me introduce these people briefly. Until his retirement, Dawkins was Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, and he wrote some books, including, of course, The Selfish Gene, and the one which probably most of you will have heard of, The God Delusion, which now is 10 years old. And it is showing its age a little bit. I think that, in effect, the conversation has moved on quite radically, but nonetheless, the questions that Dawkins raises are, I think, very, very interesting. And that's what Dawkins looks like, in case you're wondering. Lewis, of course, again, all of you will know him very well. His final job was Professor of Medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, and his best-known books include, well, Mere Christianity, and, of course, Surprised by Joy. Many of you want to say put in the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm very happy about that, and that's what Lewis looked like back in the 1940s. So let's begin to look at these questions, but I want to lay some background. And what I want to do is just begin by looking at the transition these people made. Dawkins was an evolutionary biologist who moved from what seems to have been a rather unremarkable Anglicanism to atheism, whereas, of course, with Lewis, who read classics in English, he moved from atheism to what he called mere Christianity. For those who are wondering, mere Christianity for Lewis is a form of Christianity that does not accentuate denominational distinctives. In other words, you're a Christian, and if you're also an Anglican or a Baptist or whatever, that's fine, but being a Christian is what really matters. So these people have moved directions, and therefore it's very, very interesting to look at the reasons for their transitions. So let's look then at the first question I want to raise this evening. As I've already said, Lewis and Dawkins have diametrically opposite transitions in their life, so let's try and set this in context by looking at some trends in philosophy. I don't want you to be worried about this, just stay with me as I explain what this is about, and you'll see why it's so important. Dawkins is a very modern person, and he very much echoes the ideas you find in Descartes' Discourse on Method or Spinoza's Ethics. And basically this says, look, you can get certainty without recourse to God by using reason. That in effect, you can deduce certain necessary truths, or what are sometimes called luminously self-evident propositions. In other words, you prove something before you believe it. That's the test you use. If you can't prove it, then you shouldn't believe it. Now, that's what people thought, but they don't really think that anymore. And in more recent years, there's been a trend towards postmodernity. And this is very much a reaction against, if you like, the excesses, the misjudgments of modernity. And you find this in Heidegger's Being and Time, Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigation, and Gadamer's Truth and Method. And basically, here's the key point. The key point is you realize you cannot prove everything that really matters. That in effect you have to make what are sometimes called fiduciary judgments. These are things I can trust, even though I cannot believe them to be true. Lewis emphasizes the importance of truth, but he is also very alert to the limits of reason to be able to demonstrate things. And that's a point that's going to come out very, very clearly in what we're about to talk about. And one of the points I want to make here is that postmodernity is not saying, look, you can believe anything you like. It's much more saying, look, we have to face up to a very disconcerting idea, which is there is something about human beings which means we cannot prove the things that really matter to us. That's just the way things are. We've got to learn to live with that and come to terms with it. So let's begin to look at this in more detail. There's Dawkins talking about religious faith. Faith, he writes, means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. In other words, faith is about running away from reality. It's about not engaging. It's about not using your mind. And in fact, in his Selfish Gene, he even went so far as to say faith is a kind of mental illness. I think that was probably an unwise statement. But certainly for Dawkins, if you like, there is science that proves everything 100%. And then there's this weird thing called religion, which kind of way has 0% evidence. And people just trust this without thinking. So for Dawkins, faith is necessarily blind. Now, back in the 60s, I would have accepted that. But I don't now. I want to begin to open up some of the reasons why you might want to raise questions about this. This is Dawkins talking about the role of faith in science. And as you will see, there is no role for faith in science, because science proves what it knows to be right. Dawkins writes, faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, I've shown round earlier this afternoon your wonderful new science book, and my guess is that many of you will be looking at this quotation and just saying this doesn't seem a very reliable account of the scientific method. Because in science you have evidence, and one of the big questions is how do you interpret this evidence? For example, there are some who would say the evidence is best interpreted in terms of there being a single universe. Some now would say the evidence is best interpreted in terms of a multiple universe, but we don't know which is right. In other words, it's not a question of faith being superfluous. It's certain scientists believing this is the best explanation of the evidence, certain scientists believing that is the best explanation of the evidence, but you can't absolutely be sure. And the scientist is in a very difficult position of saying, well, look, on the basis of the evidence which is not, in effect, knocked down, we have to make a judgment about what is right. And I'll say more about this in a moment. And certainly Dawkins' attitude towards faith underlies the attitudes we find in the new atheism. What you believe, what you see is what you get. And particularly important, reality is limited to what reason and science can prove. And one of the questions I want to raise with you tonight is whether a world which simply consists of things that reason and science can prove is the kind of world you and I can live in. In other words, is it existentially satisfying? And we'll come back to that point presently because it's very important. But I also want to raise a fundamental question as to whether Dawkins is right. Have a look at this quote again. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. It's very modern, but the key point is it's just not right. Dawkins fails to make a distinction between, I'll read these phrases very carefully, the total absence of supporting evidence and the absence of totally supporting evidence. And the point I want to make is really, it's that second phrase which is so important. Dawkins goes for the first, faith is just about the total absence of supporting evidence, but the reality is that if the evidence is not totally supporting, you have to make a judgment about what the best way of interpreting the evidence is. You believe this is right, but you cannot actually show it's right. I'll come back to that point, but it does raise a big question about Dawkins' approach. And there are many cases where the evidence is supportive of several outcomes. And as I think many of you will know, proof really is limited to mathematics and logic. And that's wonderful. But mathematics and logic have relatively little traction on the big questions like the meaning of life. What is good? How do we lead a good life? I've given you that example already to make that point. But really, it's not just, Dawkins giving an unsatisfactory answer to questions like the universe or a multiverse. It's much more that he's on the modern side of this dividing line between modernity and postmodernity. And most would simply go with Terry Eagleton, who positions himself like this when he says, "We hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain." In plain English, he's saying all of us believe certain things we think are very important, and we also think we are entirely justified in holding them, but actually, when the chips are down, you can't prove they're right. And the key point here is just look at that. That's the way life is. Some of you will know the very famous Oxford philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin. And one of the points that Berlin makes is this. If you look at all the beliefs that humanity have held, you can put them into three categories. Those you can prove by science, those you can prove by reason, and those that you can't prove in either of those ways. And Berlin's point is that actually categories 1 and 2, that is, proved by science, proved by reason, are actually quite small categories. Category 3 is the big one. That's where every religious, every anti-religious, every moral, every political belief you hold belongs. For example, I believe democracy is better than fascism. That affects me in a big way. If you were to say to me, well, that's very interesting, can you prove that? I'd have to say no. I think that rape is wrong. If you were to say to me, well, that's very interesting, can you prove that's right? I have to say no. But A, I still think I'm right, and B, it's very important. So what I'm trying to say to you is you might like to think about this, think of the things that really matter to you, the beliefs that give your life direction, animation, and purpose. And you'll find Berlin's right. They're in that third category. You can prove that 2 and 2 make 4. You can prove that the chemical form of water is H2O. But actually, that isn't going to give you a reason to get up in the morning. You need more than that. In other words, if I could put it sort of rather pseudo-intellectual way, you need existential traction, beliefs that are relevant, that actually give your life a foundation and a framework within which you can live. So let's turn to C.S. Lewis. Lewis is very interesting, as I think many of you will know. Lewis, interestingly, described himself as an empirical theist who came to faith through induction. Now, what, many of you will say, does he mean by that? Let me try and explain. Lewis began as an atheist, and we know pretty well why he was an atheist as a young man. 2 reasons: science and suffering. Science, because for Lewis, science proved its beliefs, and therefore religious belief was simply on a lower level of knowledge and was not to be taken seriously. But the issue of suffering was really important for Lewis. Lewis just said, look, there is suffering in the world. If there were a God, there wouldn't be suffering in the world. And as many of you will know, Lewis served in the British Army during the First World War, experienced a lot of suffering himself, saw some of his best friends killed in battle. And his experience of the Great War said to him, look, this is a mess. If there was a God, this wouldn't be happening. The existence of trauma and suffering in the Great War is an indication there isn't a God. But Lewis then went to Oxford to study classics, and as a student began to think more deeply and began to realize that things were not quite that straightforward. For example, let's just look at one of these. Suppose there is no God. Well, there's an awful lot of suffering in the First World War, and you can't blame God for that now because there's no God to blame. So who's responsible for this mess? Well, it's human beings. And Lewis found that actually in embracing atheism, he also had to embrace an understanding of human nature which was deeply flawed and damaged and possibly even evil. And he found that very, very unsettling. But here's the key point. Lewis began to think, look, maybe atheism makes some sort of rational sense, but it doesn't actually excite me. It doesn't give me a reason to live, a reason to hope. In other words, it doesn't do anything for me. And it began to open Lewis up to some deeper questions. This is Lewis in his autobiography, talking about the kind of reasons that made him wonder about atheism. This is written in 1953. He is looking back at himself in the late 1910s, the early 1920s. And this is the dilemma he found himself in. On the one hand, there was a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. In other words, a rich, imaginative world. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. So, lovely phrase. That's where Lewis was, in the midst of that glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Now, do you see the point he's trying to articulate? He's limiting himself to what science and reason can prove. And he's looking at that and saying it isn't really very interesting. It's grim. It's meaningless. And yet there's something inside him, a deeper voice that's saying there is more to life than this. There's something beyond the limits of reason that his deepest intuitions were screaming out. There is more. And Lewis began to wonder, A, were those intuitions right? And B, if they were, how did you find this? So really that brings us to how Lewis discovered Christianity. Why did Lewis embrace Christianity so excitedly? Well, really, this is the answer, that Lewis saw Christianity as a big picture. In other words, something that called out to be evaluated in terms of its ability to fit in what he observed and experienced. Now, that's this empirical bit. That's this induction bit. It's all about saying, look, here are the observations. How well does a theory fit these? And you judge the reliability of the theory by its ability to fit in the evidence. This is one of Lewis's best-known quotes. It comes at the end of a lecture called "Is Theology Poetry?" Given at Oxford in the 1940s. If you want to know the answer to that question, it all depends what you mean by theology and what you mean by poetry. But this is the final sentence in the essay. And it's Lewis explaining why he thinks Christianity is so robust. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, it's an image he's using. He's saying, look, Christianity is like an intellectual sun rising on the landscape, and as it rises, it burns away the mist, it illuminates things you see more clearly, more further than would otherwise have been the case. Sure, there are going to be patches of darkness and shadow, but you see far better than would otherwise be the case. And for Lewis, that's what really matters. Christianity is about being able to see things as they really are, having this coherent, this rich vision of reality, which Lewis articulates in many ways, including, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia. Now here's John Polkinghorne, a scientist turned theologian, just reflecting on the kind of issues that Lewis and Dawkins are raising about evidence. And Polkinghorne is just saying, look, it seems to me we're stuck with having to accept things that we believe to be right but can't prove to be right, and realizing that that's the way we are as human beings. We're caught in a situation where the really meaningful beliefs, even atheism, can't be proved to be right. Neither science nor religion can entertain the hope of establishing a logically coercive proof of the kind that only a fool could deny. No one could avoid some degree of intellectual precariousness, and there's a consequent need for a degree of cautious daring in the quest for truth. You think about that. My atheist friends believe there is no God. I believe there is a God. And actually, one of the things I want you to notice is that both atheists and Christians take their position as a matter of faith. I believe there is no God. I believe there is a God. In fact, looking back on my own conversion, I think I would now say it wasn't so much that I moved from unbelief to faith. It was that I moved from one faith, which I discovered to be inadequate, to a different faith. Because that's the human situation. When beliefs really matter, you can't prove they're right. But you can still give good reasons for thinking so. Those who are philosophers, it's about justification, giving good reasons for something, not proof. Proof is about maths and logic. But for the rest of these ideas, we very often find we have to say, I think this is right, I've got good reasons for thinking it, I can't prove it, but then that's just the way things are. And realizing that that puts us in a very different place. So with that point in mind, let's look at a second question. I think it's very interesting. Does science disprove God? Now, Dawkins perhaps wouldn't say science disproves God, but would say something like this. Science makes God unnecessary and incredible. In other words, scientific explanations are always going to win out. Something happens, you give a scientific explanation, that is the end of it. You might give a religious explanation which involves God, but for Dawkins, the scientific explanation excludes any other explanation. And his argument is the progress of science always entails the retreat of faith. And then, of course, that point I made earlier, science proves its assertions, religion just asserts them. I'm going to leave those statements on the screen for a few more minutes, but I'm going to look at them and just raise some doubts in your mind. Dawkins is wonderful in terms of use of words. He gives us some memorable statements, but I'm more concerned about the ideas that lie behind them. So we'll come back to Dawkins in a moment, but what about Lewis? Well, Lewis makes several points. Science is provisional. It's always on a journey, and that journey hasn't ended. And the key point is that scientists today believe things which they didn't believe 100 years ago, and we don't know what they will believe 100 years from now. Some of you have read Michael Polanyi's fascinating book, Personal Knowledge. In that book, Polanyi explains his dilemma as a research scientist. He says, look, I believe that there are certain theories which at the moment are believed by most scientists, it's scientific consensus, but I also know that science is progressive. And that means that in 40 years' time, some of these things I believe today will be shown to either be inadequate or wrong. And the difficulty is, I don't know which ones they are. And that's a very unsettling position, but those of you who are scientists will know it already. You'll say, this is what we think today, and we've got very good reason for thinking this. But as science progresses, it may move us off in different directions, and we have to live with that uncertainty. Secondly, Lewis argues that the process of induction, in other words, here's the evidence, here's trying to tease out what the best explanation of this evidence might be, doesn't deliver the certainty that many seem to crave. Now, there's a very interesting point here. I don't want to get into a big debate about what the word fundamentalism means. But one theme, one trait, which is very often seen as significant, is that fundamentalists want absolute certainty. They're not prepared to live with this degree of ambiguity. You can have a degree of uncertainty, but still trust that this big picture is so good that actually it can be trusted and inhabited. And one of the points that Lewis makes is actually that there's always going to be this degree of intellectual uncertainty. And that's just what we've got to learn to live with. Fundamentalists will say no. And I wonder if Dawkins is actually a kind of atheist fundamentalist who is not prepared to accept the idea that you can be an atheist while at the same time saying, but I'm not sure about this. And actually I can see why other people might believe in God. Most atheists, this may surprise you, but it's true, most atheists will take that second position. This is what I think, but I realize it's complicated, and I'm not being dogmatic. I can see why others might take a different position. Not, I'm afraid, Dawkins. And the final point is one I just touched on, that Christianity is able to provide an intellectual framework that makes sense of the scientific enterprise and its successors. There's a quote from a man called William Inge. He's a theologian, and it's a wonderful statement. What Inge is saying is, look, that there are rationalists, people like, now we'd say like Richard Dawkins, who says, look, God's somewhere in the world, so we just try and figure out where he is and prove he's there. And if we can't prove it, he's not there. But Inge then says, that's not what God is like. Rationalism tries to find a place for God in his picture of the world, but God cannot be fitted into a diagram. He is rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it's set. Now, I want to suggest to you that's very important. What Inge is saying is, look, God is not like a teapot orbiting the planet Jupiter or something. God is the basis of everything. God is the big picture. And it's not about trying to find something in this world. It's trying to find something that lies behind this world and behind each of our lives. And that's a different way of thinking. Let's go back to this point as to whether scientific advance always entails religious retreat. That's what Dawkins says. I'm not sure he's right. I don't think actually he convinces me he knows very much about the history of science. So I'm going to talk to you a few moments about shifts in cosmology. The question I'm going to ask you is this. Supposing we were here 100 years ago, and I was giving you a lecture on the origins of the universe. What would I say, reflecting the scientific consensus of 1916? Well, I can tell you what that consensus was. And here it is. This is a leading Swedish scientist whose name I'm afraid I cannot pronounce. So let's just say a Swedish scientist who basically, in a very famous book called Worlds in the Making, articulated the scientific consensus of the early 20th century. The universe, in its essence, has always been what it is now. Matter, energy, and life have only varied as to shape and position in space. In other words, it makes this absolutely clear, the universe did not have an origin. It's always been there. There's localized redistribution, but that's not important. This religious language about creation makes no sense. If the universe has always been there, how can you talk about creation? End of discussion. Now, as I think you all know, we are in a very different place 100 years later. Because, of course, people like the work of Edwin Hubble and others, looking at the expansion of the universe, began to open up what we call the standard cosmological model, which in plain English is just saying, look, the universe came into existence by a process we don't really understand, but it happened. And so we have to come to terms with the fact there was a singular event which science cannot go behind, which actually lies behind everything we presently know in the universe. And you will not be surprised to know that the language of creation is back on the table in a big way. There's a debate about whether you talk about origination or creation, but those are very, very closely related ideas, and you can see how significant this is. Now, atheist scientists were very, very suspicious about the Big Bang. Fred Hoyle said, look, it sounds terribly religious. If we start talking about this Big Bang, this origin of the universe, people will start going to church again, which he didn't think was a very good idea at all. Or you may think of Steven Weinberg's very famous words in 1967, saying, look, what Fred Hoyle's steady-state theory, the universe has always been there, is philosophically the most attractive theory because it least resembles the account given in Genesis. And Weinberg, as an atheist, thought that was a jolly good thing, but he then added, although I think very reluctantly, it's a pity the steady-state theory is contradicted by experiment. So I just want to say to you, look, this meta-narrative that Dawkins is constructing, scientific advance always means religious retreat. It's not like that. I'm sure there's some areas where it's true, but in other areas it's not. The whole idea of creation is back on the table today in a big way. So let's look at this debate which happened in 1948. I think most of us here today don't recall this owing to not being born, but this was, I assure you, a very influential debate on Radio 3 between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston. It was called The Question of God, and they looked at a number of issues. For example, do you need to believe in God to have a stable and reliable morality? Copleston won that part of the debate. But one part of the debate was, do we need God to explain the universe? And Russell won that. Because he said, look, the universe has always been here. It requires no explanation. Therefore, God's out of the picture. That would no longer be the case. Indeed, as some of you will know, this debate was replayed in 1998, 50 years afterwards, when the Christian writer William Lane Craig debated the atheist Anthony Flew. And on this point, Craig caused severe discomfort for Anthony Flew. If the universe came into being, and either happened by a mechanism we don't understand, or it was caused by something, and either of those opens the way to theistic belief. Some of you will know that Flew was quite shaken by this, and actually, we certainly stopped being an atheist. He became, I suppose, a rather generic deist instead, but certainly he was very shaken by this. But let's now look at a fascinating question. Do you remember earlier I said Dawkins is saying, look, you give a scientific explanation, and that means there's no need to give any other explanation. Scientific explanations always trump anything else. I want to ask you whether you think that's right. I'm going to suggest it's more complicated than that. So what I want to suggest is that maybe a scientific explanation is part of a bigger picture, but only part. Think of that language about a big picture I gave you earlier, drawing on Lewis. What if science fills in part of that big picture, but leaves empty great big areas? Do those have to stay empty, or can we bring in insights from other areas to do this? Let me talk to you about Frank Rhodes, who was a very famous British geologist who went on to become president of Cornell University in the 1990s, had to say about watching a kettle boil. And Rhodes used this analogy back in the 1960s, so he invites his readers to imagine a kettle boiling on a gas ring. Okay, so previous generations' technology. Here's his question. Why is the kettle boiling? Here's the scientific explanation. Because the gas is burning, and thus is converting chemical energy into heat. The heat raises the temperature of the water to the point at which it boils, so it's very, very simple. There's a perfectly good scientific explanation for why that kettle is boiling. But then Rhodes says, actually, if you don't mind, there's also a second explanation, which is I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. And Rhodes says, look, there are two explanations. Does explanation one invalidate explanation two? No, it doesn't, does it? Does explanation two invalidate explanation one? No. They're both part of a bigger picture. Here's how Rhodes put this himself. These are different answers, but both are true, both are complementary, and not competitive. One answer is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. That's an approach I want to commend to you. Science shades in part of that picture, and it's great. But the picture is bigger than that. And there are other things that need to come into it. Watch what I'm doing, okay? I'm pointing. Some of you will say, why are you pointing? And one explanation might be, well, there are electrical impulses shooting down your arm, causing muscles to contract, and as a result, you're pointing. I want to say it's absolutely right, but it's only part of the picture, isn't it? It's because I wanted to point to this beautiful thing, looks like a television camera here, and draw your attention to that. Those are both right. They're both part of the picture. Neither is the full picture. But if you want the full picture, you've got to fill in each of the elements. Dawkins only lets us fill in a very small part of the picture. I'm saying, Lewis is saying, the picture is bigger than that. So we come now to the final point I want to look at. What's the point of life? Which is a perfectly reasonable question to ask, because it opens up some very big issues. It is very easy to adopt reductionist approaches to human beings, and saying something like, we're just atoms and molecules. And, or our sole purpose is to reproduce our genes, which in effect reduces human significance to the level of our components. Now, here's the point I want to make. I am made of atoms and molecules. And I hope this doesn't come as a surprise, but so are you. It's the little word just that bothers me. Because you see, everything in this room, including this and lots of other interesting things, are also made of atoms and molecules. It does not explain what is distinctive, what is different about human beings. And sure, we want to reproduce our genes. Okay, that's part of a picture. But it's not the only thing that needs to be said. And the real problem I have with a lot of people like Dawkins and others is they simply reduce human significance to one thing and say that's it. I want to begin by saying life is a bit more complicated than that. What about existential issues? And this brings us to a very important question. There is a large body of psychological literature which says something like this. As a matter of empirical observation, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, human beings actively seek meaning in life and in the universe. It's almost as if there's a deep instinct within us to do this. Now you might say, well, this is just a random outcome of the evolutionary process. Or you might say, actually, maybe this is what the Christian idea of the image of God is all about. But it's there. And it means that really, this question of what is the meaning of life, is there purpose, is there value, is very, very significant. Now here's Dawkins writing in his book River Out of Eden, where in effect he's saying, look, there's no good, no evil, no point, no purpose. The universe we observe, he writes, has precisely the properties we expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But actually, that's not about proving that. That, in effect, is saying, that's the way I see it. That's saying, when I look at the universe, that's what I see. Going back to Lewis, who uses the image of a lens. What happens if Dawkins is using a lens that's out of focus? So you don't see it. Not because it's absent, but because the instrument you're using to view it doesn't allow you to see it. You might think you're on the seashore and you're looking out, and on the horizon of the sea you see a sort of white dot, and you get a telescope out, and initially it's all blurred, you can't see a thing. Then you focus it, and you can see a little yacht with people in it. You bring something into focus. For Lewis, the Christian faith is like a lens that brings things into focus. And that, I think, is very important. But Lewis also talks about this whole issue of reduction. And some of you will know The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And in this novel, one of the children unwisely shows off their scientific knowledge, and a wise old man asks, what is a star? And Eustace, one of the chief actors in The Dawn Treader, says, in our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. And the old man says, look, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it's made of. Now, you might look at that because, as I was saying earlier, each of us is made up of atoms and molecules and lots of other things. But that's just what we're made of. Who we are is something very different indeed. And that really is what is so interesting about us. It's not what is at the bottom of the pile, atoms and molecules, it's what's at the top. And that is what causes us to ask these deep questions about meaning, purpose, value. Who am I? What's life all about? Do I matter to anyone? And we all ask those kind of questions, and we all look for answers. The question is, where do we find those answers? This is Peter Medawar, won the Nobel Prize for Medicine some years ago, a rationalist, but one who was deeply aware of the limits of rationalism and the limits of the sciences. Here's a quote from his book, The Limits of Science. It's one of the last books he wrote, sort of lifetime's wisdom condensed into a small book. He says, we need to acknowledge that there are questions that science cannot answer and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. What sort of questions? Well, those are your philosophers, what Karl Popper called ultimate questions. The meaning of life. Purpose. Why am I here? These are these big questions. They're existentially important. And those of you who are scientists, you're also human beings. And that means you're going to be asking these questions. And if Medawar is right, science is not going to give you an answer. You need to look for answers somewhere else. So the key point about meaning is, look, it's not something empirical. You can't read it off. It's not like temperature or something like that. It's about interpreting reality. And even if you say, look, there is no meaning, that is not an empirical observation. That is an interpretation, a matter of faith itself. Whether you say there is meaning, there is no meaning, you are in both cases taking that position as a matter of faith. So I think you need to say, well, given that this is a matter of faith, which is the best answer to that question? This is a man called Alex Rosenberg, an American philosopher, who wrote a book called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And this is what he tells his readers. Is there a God? No. End of question. Okay? Because, that's what science shows. What's the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. What's the meaning of life? Ditto. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Now, in every case, you just need to expand the answer. Science shows us, or science is unable to show us, that there is meaning in life. In other words, this is very much about science being unable to tell us about the purpose of the universe, the meaning of life, or even articulate the difference between right and wrong. Now, I don't know where you're all coming from tonight, but here's what I'm going to say to you. I think for most of you here tonight, the question of the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, is actually rather important. And you are going to look at this answer and say, that is just so inadequate. I'm going to walk away from that and look for a better answer. And I want to suggest to you that that is actually a very good judgment, because it brings me into a very different philosopher called José Ortega, a Spanish philosopher, who celebrates science as I do, but says, look, there's a problem. It only gives you part of the picture. Scientific truth, he writes, is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. Bring Dawkins and Lewis into this. Dawkins would say, well, that may be true, but that's because there are no answers to those questions. Anyone who says there are answers is fraudulent. Lewis would say, this is right, but it's saying to us there are big questions opening up and big answers waiting to be discovered, and they lie on the far side of reason and science. And in embracing them, we're not becoming irrational or anti-scientific. We're simply respecting the limits of science, the limits of reason, and realizing we need answers to these questions. Faith is not about irrationalism. It's about transcending the limits of reason. That's a very different idea. Then he says these words: we're given no escape from ultimate questions. In other words, they're deeply within us, whether we like it or not. Scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. And as someone who was a scientist myself, I would just want to put a great big tick against that and say, look, science is wonderful, it's really, really good, but you've got to respect its limits and not force it to answer questions it can't answer. And when you start looking at science like that, it gives you part of this big picture, but it doesn't fill everything in. And because you and I are human beings, we need a better, bigger picture. And I haven't time to defend this tonight, but the key point I want to make is that this is where Christianity comes into this, by giving you an intellectual framework, what Lewis calls a big picture, which helps you make sense of the success of science, but also gives you a basis for meaning and purpose and morality. And we all need something like that if we're going to lead meaningful lives. So I've been sort of kicking Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis around a bit tonight and just opening up what I hope you'll feel is an interesting discussion. There is a lot more that needs to be said, but I hope you'll feel that the questions I've opened up are interesting, and I'm very happy now to let you throw questions at me for the next, about 10 minutes or so, and my distinguished colleague is going to moderate the question and answer session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir, for this excellent, engaging presentation. Most of the thoughts that you and I have carried with us, we may not have articulated the way that Professor McGrath has done now. And you have given us vocabulary, ideas, and methods, and we thank you for that. Now the floor is open for questions, friends. So Chris is coming the other side, and I will be coming here. So may your questions be brief.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. My question is why we have to divide in a binary way like religious and scientist. Is there something in between in relation to morality?
Yeah. This is a very good question. The questioner is asking, look, what I've been doing in my lecture is really dichotomizing. There's science and there's faith, and as if these are two completely inseparable worlds. And I think you made a very important point. Here's the first thing I want to say. The first thing I want to say is that what I'm doing is imagining that there are people who are scientists who are not religious, and people who are religious and not scientists. And so they will tend to think in two very different ways. But in many ways, the very interesting question which you've asked and which I want to answer is, what happens to someone who is both a scientist and a believer, who in effect, in their own personal experience and existence, tries to weave these things together? And that seems to me to be a very important thing to do. And I try to do this in a number of ways, and I haven't time to really explore it in detail tonight. But you're quite right that there's a notional separation here where actually there doesn't need to be in reality. And another point that we might make is this. You can't really say, well, there's different kinds of experience. There's sort of scientific experience and a sort of religious experience. Because very often, if you look at if you're out at night and you see the night sky, you won't be doing that tonight, but if you were to imagine it, seeing the stars blazing in solemn brilliance, that could evoke a scientific response. I wonder what lies behind that in terms of the physical structure of the universe. It could also evoke a religious response. I wonder what lies behind that in terms of purpose and meaning and my own place in this very big and puzzling universe. And so what I'm trying to, and you're right, that really I've separated things out for the purposes of discussion, which in reality you can't really separate. Well, that's right. Yeah, if you read a philosopher like Mary Midgley, in that very nice book she wrote called, I think it's called Science and Poetry, she makes precisely that point, that actually there's a real risk that you, in effect, hold things completely apart because you don't have an adequate language. And she says maybe poetry helps you to hold these things together. And actually, I think she makes some good points there. Thank you very much. Let's keep going.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I'll give. Nick, you can speak louder, so you can speak.
People tend to regard Big Bang cosmology and evolutionary biology as scientific. Would you regard them as science or areas of faith?
Yes, again, that's a very interesting question. I think what I would say is this, that these are scientific hypotheses. That is to say, at the moment, we think these are the best way of looking at things. And interestingly, I mean, as I said, 100 years ago we didn't believe in the Big Bang. What on earth will we believe in 100 years' time? I just don't know. Or what will we believe in 100 years' time about Darwin's theory of evolution? Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Devil's Chaplain, which came out in 2003, says, in 100 years' time, our understanding of things may have changed so much that either we'll have abandoned Darwinism or changed it so radically it may be unrecognizable. And that may sound startling, but actually he's just articulating the dilemma of a scientist, that things move on. You can't freeze science and say the way we see things today is right. That's the way it is. It's that this is the way we see it now, but we have to realize that this discussion and debate will move on, and so we don't quite know where it is. So for me, and this is simply my personal viewpoint, one of the wonderful things about science is its modesty and its humility. In other words, it's saying we think this is the best way of looking at the moment, but we recognize fully that this may move on. Where I think things get difficult is people sometimes, in effect, take a provisional scientific idea and then build a metaphysical house on it. And I think Dawkins does that. I mean, Dawkins, having said that Darwinism is a provisional scientific theory, then constructs this worldview called Darwinism, which is actually an inflated reading of evolution. I have to say that I think that's very, very misleading, because in effect he's importing metaphysical ideas into that, and that certainly is a matter of faith. I think that most scientists would just be very, very cautious about this and not wish to overinterpret, precisely because we've had seen that happen so many times in the past and the results have not been good. Thank you. Let's keep going.
Thank you. Yeah.
You've put forward a lot of arguments for the existence of a God, but how are you so sure that it's a Christian God or even a monotheistic God?
Well, again, a very good question. And what I've been really talking about is saying that certainly a Christian vision of things gives you this lens which, to me at least, makes sense of it. And your question is, well, that there are other gods, aren't there? Why not them? Why this one? I think that's a very fair question. And so let me begin to give you an answer, which it would take a lot longer to give, but I'm going to hit some of the points that really seem to me to be relevant. One is this, that really one of the reasons that Christianity appeals to me so much is that it does believe in a God, but believes in a type of God that establishes order, that in effect enables us to have a framework which allows us to look at the regularity of the world and not have to say, in explaining why, if I were to drop this glass, it falls to the ground, without saying God made that happen. Much more, God establishes a framework within which things happen. In other words, a degree of delegation of autonomy to the created order. And that's a very key theme in Christian theology, and I find that in Christianity. Another point which again speaks to me quite deeply, which works at a different level, is this. Christianity is on its own in saying that God chose to enter this world and inhabit it in the incarnation, in other words, in Christ, who is God incarnate. And that is very, very powerful in a number of ways. One of them is that it allows you to say, well, when I ask what is God like, in some way I have an authorized visual image to help me think about that. But much more fundamentally, you are now talking about God who knows what suffering is all about. In other words, not a God who observes this world from a distance, like, for example, Aristotle's prime mover, but rather someone who chooses to enter this world so we know what it's like. Now, I'll just give you two examples. And on their own, that's not very exciting, I know, but there are supplementary reasons which I would give in defense of Christianity, not rubbishing anybody else, just saying this is why I find Christianity so exciting and engaging. And I would really need a lecture on its own to do justice to a very good question, I'm afraid. Thank you.
I would just like to, ask that I think you did a very good job showing that the atheist idea that science can disprove God is wrong, and that has a sort of existential unsatisfactoriness to it. And I would also agree that there is this age-old search for meaning that you referred to as well. But I guess my question is this, that merely because we yearn for meaning, it doesn't mean meaning exists. The yearning may prove to be futile. And I was just, I'm just wondering if the sort of the logical end point of what you've said to us this evening, Alister, is it should be or is a sort of fence-sitting agnosticism.
Thank you. I think this may be our last question. I want to answer this properly. I think when I was talking about the large body of psychological literature saying that we seek for a big picture or meaning, I think I did make the point that this doesn't say it's right, it doesn't say it's wrong, it just says it's human. I think that's a very important point to make. I mean, one of my big arguments with humanism, which most of us here tonight means a sort of secularist or anti-religious position, is that actually if it is human to quest for meaning, and religion is actually one of the classic answers to that question, then it's very difficult to see how humanism can be against that, because it's a natural human thing to do. And so I think I'd want to say maybe humanism needs to redefine itself as secular humanism, which I think is a fair way of reading it. But you're right. I mean, as I hope I did make clear, in observing empirically that human beings quest for meaning, that, as I said, might just be an accident of no significance whatsoever. Or it might also be this is something that's built into us, something that's as integral to human identity as the quest for food or friendship or sustenance, which is actually an inbuilt clue into what life is all about. And you see, we can't answer that question empirically. That's the problem. We can observe this. We can say, this is what seems to be happening. And that's a very important point, because it does correlate very, very strongly with one thing I haven't talked about tonight at all, but is really interesting. Because I think I've presented Christianity to you largely in cognitive terms. This helps you make sense of things. But actually, the psychologist, Ken Pargament being a very good example, or Crystal Park, will say, look, it's not just making sense of the world, it's being able to cope with it. In other words, it gives you what's called resilience. You know, you have this framework which allows you to face difficult situations and actually go through them in a very significant way. So that's another point to put in this framework. But we don't know whether this is arbitrary. We don't know whether this quest for significance, this quest for meaning, is simply, if you like, a pointless delusion, some sort of self-consolation that might have no significance whatsoever. We can't prove that empirically. But what I can say is that if you view that from a Christian perspective, and you say, look, let's just take a Christian lens, look at this. You say, gosh, that is precisely what you'd expect. It's all to do with the Christian understanding of this idea of the image of God. And actually you find this stated, I think, very clearly in a prayer by an early Christian theologian called Augustine of Hippo, who wrote these words. It's a prayer, but just see if this makes sense. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. And in many ways, I suppose the question is, do you find that framework helpful in making sense of the enigmas that life throws up, the experiences that you have? And in many ways, both Dawkins and Lewis are really inviting us to test their very different templates against what we see and observe in this world. I think that's where I have to leave you tonight. I mean, I've come to my answer. I'm not forcing it on you. But I'm just saying that that really is the big question. If you believe something, how well does it help you make sense of this puzzling world in which we live? And I'll leave you with that question. Let me thank our questioners for some very good questions. I'm afraid the answers weren't always so good, but it's been really wonderful to be able to engage with you in this way. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir, for your spellbinding presentation and also the questions that you have raised and you have answered. Now it is my privilege to invite our Dean, Dean Atulya Nagar, Dean of Sciences, to come and then tell how this university is planning, and particularly the Faculty of Sciences, to engage with this question further.
Thank you, Professor Jayraj. I'm Atulya Nagar. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science and a Professor of Mathematical Sciences. I have keen interest in this topic, Professor. I am also a Hindu Vedic scholar, and I have read some work on Vedic mathematics by Swami Bharti Krishna Tirth, Shankaracharya, Swami Bharti Krishna Tirth. And it's exciting that some of the work by Shankaracharya Bharti Krishna Tirth actually attempts to prove, much of the literature is now lost, but it attempts to prove some of the mathematical theorems. I don't research on those areas. I think the RAF will probably not accept some of that. Yes, but it is exciting time for the faculty here at this university. I think in the context of what we are discussing today, we exist in this university within very strong humanities tradition in this university. So we are very privileged and very proud of our humanities tradition within which we function. Of course, we of course do serious sciences here, broad range of subject areas, including cognitive psychology, experimental psychology, mathematics, computer science, robotics engineering, electronics engineering, health sciences, biomedical sciences, nutrition science, sports and exercise science, and so on. It's a growing faculty, and we have just recently, only in January, 25th of January, opened our brand new state-of-the-art laboratories. Of course, all very welcome to see our laboratories and the innovations we do in our laboratories, the work we do. It's exciting time for the Faculty of Science, and of course, university's huge investment shows the importance of science, importance that we place on sciences within our university. There's just 1 minute I will take to talk about very important thing we have here in this university. We call it Foundation R. It's a tradition, it has been running for a number of years now. Every Wednesday afternoon from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. the university community stops. We stop everything, no meetings, no teaching. And that is 1 hour when we reflect on first order questions and things like these. In fact, and the faculties take turn to organize these foundation hours. And it is the turn of my faculty, starting from March, February and March. And the theme of the foundation hour from my faculty, being organized by my faculty, is actually this: science and faith. So you are most welcome to participate in that forum. Of course, also contribute to that forum. So anyone who wants to, Mr. Paul Rooney is there. He's the one who leads and organizes the event for me. And we will of course publish this on our website. If any contributions you want to make, you are more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that introduction. So it's an ongoing tradition, and so we want to thank you for giving us a very good start in that tradition, sir. Now it is my privilege to give a vote of thanks. How should we begin it? In Euro-American tradition, you may just thank the person who does the job, but not in my tradition. We go to a different level. See, in Tamil, and I am told it's also in the Sanskrit the same way by Nagar, if we want to thank, we remember at least 4 types of people. I'll recite it in Tamil and then interpret it. Mada, Pida, Guru, Deivam. Mada is mother. Pida is father. Guru is the teacher. And then comes God. Because it is the mother who tells the child, teaches the child, and tells who the father is. And father and mother jointly take the child to the teacher. The teacher educates, gives them perspectives, and then introduces them in scientific and many ways to the realities of life, and then individual discovers. And then being grateful to what a person has become, worships God and then enjoys. That is the tradition. Mada, Pida, Guru, Deivam. So in this context, sir, we want to thank you to your parents and to your family that has helped you to become who you are. And same holds to our students, our colleagues, and everybody who is here, because we are representing large entities. Though we are single here, individuals, but we are representing. So when you go back, take the ideas that you have gained here and then introduce it further, may it have a ripple effect and go on and on. So you will be given a small slip just asking for your name and also your email ID. The Andrew Wall Center organizes time-to-time events. The next major event is on 19th of March. It is on diaspora Christian communities and the questions they ask, what can world Christianity answer? And the next major will be Bible in Asian and African Christianity, because this campus served as the place where Jerusalem Bible was edited and published 50 years ago. So we are going to celebrate that. So if you are interested to know more about what the Underworld Center is doing and what is happening here, please write your name and write your email legibly. I will use it very confidentially. And then please, maybe Daniel, would you stand at, where are you? Daniel, would you stand maybe on the top door, and one other, maybe Jillian? Jillian is here, maybe here. So please give the papers to both of them. And our Dr. McGrath will be happy to sign the books. If you would please come on that side and line here, and we will go from there. Finally, to end up, In Tamil, there is a very, very influential poet, Thiruvalluvar. We say, no speech is complete without referring to him. That's what I'm going to do. If we want to have any approval by the audience, this is what we need to do in my tradition. Refer to Thiruvalluvar. It tells, Ennandri kondrarkum uivundam uivillai, seinandri kondra magarku. There is redemption for anybody who may forget anything, but not leave out gratitude. So gratitude is the greatest virtue that will nurture us as we go along. Just remembering for people who have taught us, who have fed us, who have nurtured us, who have raised us up. And today, sir, you have given us two ideas, brought two ideas into conversation, faith and science in relation to God. May this conversation continue. And as we thank you and we give you thanks. Finally, we say, probably the Germans have learnt it from Indians. The Indian, when we say bye-bye, it's not bye-bye, go and go. They will say, poi varangal. You can tell to your neighbors, poi varangal. Can you say it to them? Now you need to know what it means. Poi means go, but please come back. That's what it means. Now you can go, but don't forget, come again. That's what the Germans said. Auf Wiedersehen. See you again. So God bless you. We said, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. May the joy accompany you.